6B, 4B, 2B, chiseled shaped pencil strokes, strokes over strokes over strokes. Cyrus shaping city images of old Delhi and New York, shaping buildings and theme pavilions, shaping backdrops for theatre and movies. Cyrus shaping young minds and young hearts. Mumbai born and educated, Cyrus Shavaksa Hormasti Jhabvala was an unusual and a multi-faceted personality. An academic, an artist, and a professional architect. A fellow of Royal Institute of British Architects, Ustad Jhabvala taught at the Delhi Polytechnic from 1949 to 1957. In 1967, he rejoined as the head of the Department of Architecture of what by then had become the School of Planning and Architecture, eventually retiring as its director in 1978. For well over 30 years, he practiced as a partner in the well-regarded firm of Anand Apte and Jhabvala, or Aj for short. Aj belonged to the first generation of post-independence modern architects in Delhi, along with Hines Bhavabhatia, Chaudhry Gulzar Singh, Kanvinder Rai, Steven Balla, and amongst the public sector, Habib Rahman and Man Singh Rana. Aj handled an astonishing number of projects cutting across domains and scale, to include urbanism, architecture, interior design, and exhibition design. In his later life, Ustad Jhabvala's sketches and paintings became well known and were published as books. Born to revolutionary parents, Meherban and Savoksha Jhabvala, Cyrus was married to the renowned novelist and screenwriter Ruth Bravard, and after his demise in 2014, their three very special daughters decided to institute the annual Cyrus Jhabvala Memorial Lecture in partnership with SBA Delhi to celebrate his memory and encourage discourse on post-independence and contemporary architecture in India. The first lecture in the series was delivered by Mr. Rajwal, who is with us this evening, while Mr. Rahul Mehrotra delivered the second one last year. Ladies and gentlemen, we feel deeply privileged and delighted to have with us this evening Professor Christopher Charles Benninger, who has very kindly agreed to deliver the third Jhabvala Memorial Lecture, interestingly coinciding as it is for the first time with the Ustad's birth anniversary. And before we begin the lecture, may I request Professor Mahavir, the Dean Academics from the School of Planning and Architecture, to kindly welcome the Honorable Speaker and the esteemed guests. Professor Mahavir.
Good evening. Welcome to the third CYRUS Jhabvala Memorial Lecture. First, I must apologize on behalf of my director, Professor P.S. Rao, who is currently traveling and could not make it for the evening. As we all know, the Department of Architecture in Delhi Polytechnic started way back in 1942, and from then onwards, traveling through School of Town and Country Planning, School of Planning and Architecture, School of Planning and Architecture deemed university, today we have a status of an institution of national importance. We do have an SPA Act which was established by the Parliament in 2014. And we also know that from a very few number of students, we have now about 150 undergraduate students, over 200 postgraduate students, and over 80 PhD, current PhD scholars in the school, including those, some of whose names were approved last evening. Now, in a year when the school, especially the Department of Architecture of the school, is about to begin the celebrations of its 75 years, I think it's great coincidence that we are at the same time roughly having the memorial lecture for a professor who almost started at the same time when the Department of Architecture started. I think the third CYRUS Jhabvala Memorial Lecture by another equally renowned and respected Professor Prof.Benninger makes a very good opportunity for the school, opportunity for all the fellow associates. I, on my personal behalf and on behalf of the school, once again welcome all present here, all alumni, all associates, all former students who still recall the teachings by Professor Jhabvala. And I also thank personally to the Jhabvala family for associating the School of Planning and Architecture with this great event. Thank you.
I request Ranana Jhabvala to come and please introduce the speaker for the evening and also invite the speaker to the days thereafter.
Thank you, and thank you for this introduction to our father CYRUS Jhabvala. The introducer didn't introduce himself. He is Professor Iftikhar Chisti, who was teaching at the school and is a very well-known architect in Delhi, and I think many of you know him, so thank you. On behalf of the Jhabvala family, I would like to welcome all of you to today's lecture. My sister, I'm Renana. My sister Ava is come specially for a few days from England for the event. My sister Feroza, who lives in the US, could not come. My husband Harish Khare is here with us, and on behalf of all of us, we welcome all of you to this lecture. We're very pleased that our speaker today, Christopher Charles Benninger, is giving today's memorial lecture in honor of our father. Christopher is a teacher, an institution builder, and an architect. He perhaps is one of the best known architects, teachers, and institution builders in India today. He left his tenured position at Harvard's Graduate School of Design many years ago to come to India and co-founded two schools of architecture in Ahmedabad and Pune in the 1970s. As a teacher in those institutions, he has inspired countless students, and his book, which I would encourage all of you to get, is called A Letters to a Young Architect and is a bestseller, and especially to the students who are here, and has been translated into many languages. He started his practice in architecture rather late. He was, as I said, an institution builder and a teacher rather late at the age of 51, building many campuses, including IIM Calcutta and the Supreme Court of Bhutan. His buildings are modern and individualistic, and yet draw on Indian tradition and culture. We look forward to hearing his many experiences in many of these varied fields. And personally, what I would like to say is what draws me especially to his work is his use of architecture as a social tool and his commitment to inclusiveness. May I welcome Professor Benninger, and we very much look forward to your presentation today.
So it's lovely to be here. One quick correction. If I had started the School of Architecture in Ahmedabad, my name would be Balkrishna Doshi. I started the School of Planning there. Okay. And but anyway, I would like to thank the Jhabvala family. They're extremely gracious people. In fact, in 1973, I was invited by CYRUS Jhabvala to be an examiner at the Delhi School of Architecture and Planning, School of Planning and Architecture. And one of the students there, her name was Ava, who's here tonight, his daughter. But neither of us remembered each other because at that time they wouldn't allow the examiners to see the students, no? But that's a fate of chance. Now, when Renana asked me to come and give this lecture, I was kind of excited to come to Joseph Allen Stein's center. So I wrote a letter to David Stein, his son, and I said, you know, I'll be coming to the India International Center, and it's really going to be fun. And then he wrote me a long letter about his father and family landing in Bombay in 1952 and taking a train across India to Calcutta, where he started the School of Planning at BE College, a School of Architecture. And he talked about the lights in the villages. It was Diwali, and he told the long story. So then I thought, this solves a problem for me, because I don't know what to talk to such an erudite crowd in Delhi. I'm used to giving lectures to schools of planning and schools of architecture all over India, but talking to people in Delhi is a little scary because you people are thought leaders. People like Ranjit Siddiqui are writing in the press all the time. Raj Lieberman, who would be here, writes quite often on urbanism. And we've got my Honorable Shiv Raj Patel, an old friend from Maharashtra, is an expert on so many topics, including he was administrator of Chandigarh and started the replanning of Chandigarh a couple of years ago. And then I've got a real guru, Raj Raval, here, which is quite scary to give a lecture in front of Raj now. But there are many, many people here. I must also mention Ravi Ban, because he brought landscape architecture to India way back in 1970. And the oldest person in the audience, I shouldn't really do this, but there's a person here called Diwakar Sharma, who came up and reminded me that in 1968, we were hostel mates when I came on a Fulbright to India. That's 50 years ago. And then it was 1970 when I met Om Prakash Mathur and Ravi and Ranjit Siddiqui. So there are people here. I hope I haven't forgotten somebody from 50 years ago. But there are people here who I've known for about half a century. So David told a story, and then I thought I should tell stories too. So that's what I'm going to do. India is a land of storytelling. Since time immemorial, oral narratives have been the medium of India's learning and awareness. Oral traditions have kept alive by temple artisans, priests and wandering minstrels, and dramas and village fairs and tamashas. Stories can be conveyed through songs, dances, paintings, and dramas. Indian stories often share spiritual meanings, but they also carry many ideas about self-realization. And even the British and the Nizam tried to ban, like Borakatha in South India, because they used satire and new ideas to criticize injustice and bad management of government. And we all know the post-independent age needed stories of hope and romance and apprehension also. The nation needed a vision and new identity, and Pandit Nehru was a great storyteller, and he lifted everyone's thoughts and hopes through his stories. And even our present Prime Minister likes to tell stories and talk to us about a better life to come. So stories are ingrained in the way we live here. Now, what I want to say is the human settlements we have lived in and the buildings we have lived in have also molded and tempered the way we think about space, form, and urban structure. In a way, these buildings and spaces are stories too. Experiences in urban and built space generate deductive rationality about the way the world is. They tell us, what is this world? What is it like? But they also gift us what is called formative logic about the way the world should be. If you're a good architect, if you're a student of architecture, you look at buildings and you say, this is not the way it should be better now. So they also raise formative logic. These are neither static experiences nor single-shot photo images of a context embedded in our thoughts. Rather, these experiences are narratives that have beginnings and endings, openings and closures, and yes, even conclusions and lessons. So there are stories that lie in our subconscious being, stories drawn from the choreographies of our lives, from the places we have lived in, all telling us who we are and what the world is like, giving us hints of the logic of why things are this way or that. Most of our paintings, dramas, and even our buildings betray autobiographical stories about their authors and designers that molded their existence and determined their designs. These creations that we authored are searching for the reality of themselves. The authors are actually expressing themselves through their designs and writing. Within these stories, crafted in built form, and histories laid out in our city plans are leaving eternal footprints of our being on this earth. Architects are very different from other professions. Lawyers fight cases over misdeeds of the past, and each case becomes a kind of story with protagonists. Accountants and auditors, other professionals, try to put last year's figures in an appropriate order, becoming dry prose, and they have only victims. Doctors try to save us from our past recklessness and bad fate, and these become high dramas. But these are all stories of the past. Architects and planners are always working in the realm of the future and doing something creative today that will not happen tomorrow, even next year, or even many years later. Dealing with the future is more uncertain than dealing with the present or the past. Our stories are therefore more complex, messy, and even chaotic. They are a journey through the unknown towards an unknown destination. So before I begin to tell you my stories, let me confess that architects tell their stories backwards. That is, we always begin with the end in mind. Maybe in telling you my stories, I'm telling you narratives of my future and yours. To give you an idea of what I'm pondering, let me tell you the first story that I'm calling Adventure. The story of adventure. Bringing things into order, finding patterns generic to things, making templates into which things can be ordered are the unique feats of the human brain, driving our strongest emotional compulsions. Yet this ordering project leads to something which I call the human conclusion, wherein almost all human societies come back to a common set of concerns in an interesting closure of the human condition. To make this short, can I say we all get trapped into the same rites of passage and the same predictable samskara? In other words, life is a trap. Perhaps because of my identity as an outsider, my life has been a story of escapes, seeking alternative meanings and freedom. Or perhaps I found middle-class American stereotypes just too mundane and boring to commit myself to. So I began a search even as a child, doing poorly in studies, yet finding myself immersed in art. I found montage painting more compelling than realistic landscapes. I liked chaos and the secrets of order deep within disarray. I call people who are on lifelong journeys of self-discovery travelers, because real travelers involves a bit of risk and even danger. It works without foresight, making decisions on the spur of the moment and asking oneself each morning, where should I go today? As opposed to a traveler, a tourist seeks a planned schedule of visiting pre-planned sites and events. For tourists, reservations are a must, always craving safety and predictability. Tourists are buying canned experiences. In our daily lives, we are either travelers or tourists. The known is the friend of the tourist, and the unknown is the friend of the traveler. Being a traveler of the spirit and seeking adventure of the mind are metaphors for one another. My first adventures were in playing hooky from primary school. I'd use these escapes to cycle alone into the wilderness, discovering raw nature, or walking over to the student center in the university where my father taught, and watching abstract art films, which had topics very negative, like concentration camps, ethnic cleansing, and even prostitution. These films exposed me to something that I came to know as another world. It was not the safe, clean, middle-class American world I grew up in. In 1963, I traveled across America from coast to coast through Arizona, visiting Taliesin West, which you can see here. After an inspiring afternoon, another idea struck me. There was a crazy man living in the desert who made bronze bells, and I'd read about him in Time magazine. I recalled that his name was Solari, and I thumbed through a telephone directory, finding a name, Paolo Solari, and I, with great trepidation, to call him up. Surprisingly, he answered, "Come right over." The next few days were spent exploring in the desert with him, visiting underground shelters, experiencing man-made cave dwellings, and learning how, in his backyard, in an ordinary house, he made bronze bells which he sold for thousands of dollars. Years later, many, many years later, he became very famous for Arcosanti, his utopian city in the desert. During that visit, Paolo Solari shared with me the concept of the culture of construction. He taught me that every building has a place, and each place has a unique materials, climate, craftspeople, and construction technology. So traveling sparks one's imagination. Traveling knits enriching friendships and introduces one to gurus who expose the true persona within oneself and new possibilities who you can be. One learns innate truths and concepts that will be carried through a lifetime. These insights are what we call inspiration. My roommate at Harvard in 1966 arrived from a 15,000-kilometer bicycle journey around the borders of America. He went from New York up to Canada, crossed over to Vancouver, down to Los Angeles, across to the south of America, and came back to Cambridge, Massachusetts. And this long trip inspired me, and he became my guru of adventure. So the next summer, the two of us bicycled 1,500 kilometers from Paris to Athens, where I had to attend the Delos Symposium organized by Konstantinos Doxiadis. We entered countries with no visas, and we survived on the hospitality of simple villagers and of friendly small-town people who took an interest in our life's journey. In the summer of 1967, along the back roads of Yugoslavia, I became a global citizen. I learned of humanity traveling down back roads forbidden to foreigners in a communist country, everywhere making friends out of strangers. In Athens, and on board Konstantinos Doxiadis' yacht. Konstantinos Doxiadis, you would know, is a great architect planner, and every summer he had on his boat a large symposium with about 20, 30 people invited. And he would invite about, maybe 10 or 15 very famous people, and each one had to call a protege who had to be under 30 years old, usually under 25, who came along. So Barbara Ward, the economist, invited me to come with her as her protege. So in Athens and on board the Konstantinos Doxiadis' yacht, I befriended Margaret Mead, Buckminster Fuller, Arnold Toynbee, and of course my patron Barbara Ward, and other thought leaders of the 20th century. 10 days in the Aegean Sea, hearing their stories and learning of their worldview inspired me eventually to settle here in India. In the afternoons, our small group would explore classical Greek islands and sites. One evening at Samothrace, Professor Toynbee, he must have been about 82 or 83 at the time, requested me to assist him in climbing up the hill behind the famous Winged Victory Temple, where he thought an undocumented Crusader fort would lie. Sure enough, when we reached the top of this hill, his eyes lit up with joy when he saw ruined walls on an ancient site. I was standing there looking far out to the east, and I saw a massive black sky, a huge cloud approaching us, appearing as a mighty thunderstorm headed our way. When I cautioned Professor Toynbee of the impending deluge and that we should hurry and get back down the hill, he just smiled at me and said, "Oh, no, that's not a storm. That's just Asia," laughing at me. A huge dark dust storm cloud was hovering over Turkey, and little did I know that this symposium sealed my fate to spend the rest of my life in Asia. Then Professor said to me, "Go there and you will discover yourself." On that day in June of 1967, Arnold Toynbee had turned my hazy information into knowledge and fixed my sights on the destination of my life. A year later, following Professor Toynbee's advice, I applied for and won a Fulbright Fellowship to India. I traveled around the world by plane, visiting Japan and my teacher at Harvard, Fumihiko Maki, and then I came to Cambodia on an Air France flight, again with no visa. And when I landed, I found that I was the only American in the country who was not in prison. The others were 14 pilots shot down intruding over Cambodian airspace. The other Americans, as I said, were in jail, and my fellow travelers in Phnom Penh were Viet Cong fighters on taking breaks from the war in Vietnam. Another long adventure occurred in 1971, traveling overland back to India again, from London to Bombay, across Europe, Turkey, Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, coming down the Khyber Pass, and then spending 8 weeks with Balkrishna Doshi teaching a studio in Ahmedabad, and plotting with him about starting a new school of planning in Ahmedabad, which is now the Faculty of Planning at the university. And then I moved on to Bombay, where I met a man, an interesting man called Charles Grady. It was the exhilaration of this overland adventure that lured me to India, informing me that this was my new home. One can travel on one's feet, one can travel through reading, one can travel through one's eyes, but travel one must. Travel and adventure are catalysts of imagination and inner awareness. They instill in one a compassion for humanity, and thus I'll tell a story about compassion. Again, I'll start with a little philosophy of each of my stories I tell. Traditional societies strive for the happiness of the group, while modern societies teach us to be self-sufficient, to succeed, and to strive for happiness through individual achievement. Traditional societies work with compassion as driving emotion. Advanced societies work for the happiness of the individual with competition as the driving emotion. Individual ambition and innovation, it reads, are unique feats of the human brain, driving strong emotional compulsions known as greed and pride. Regrettably, the resulting success pyramid concludes in a counterintuitive outcome. Most people are unhappy because they're somewhere in the bottom half of the pyramid, while those who are successful are often very lonely at the top. This competition model, this competition project, informs us to brush aside inequality and poverty as obvious human conclusions, perhaps something the government might deal with. Winner takes all becomes the closure of the modern human condition. To make this short, can I say we get trapped into an endless struggle for success, justifying inequality? Life is a trap. When I was a child in Florida, we lived in a segregated society. Many of you young people wouldn't realize that America, back when I grew up in the 50s and 60s, that we had different schools for different races. No? So when I was a child in Florida, we lived in a segregated society where black people sat in the back of the buses. They were not allowed to sit in the front. And their children attended black schools. They lived in shanty towns while we whites lived in manicured suburbs. This was a form of institutionalized untouchability. On a visit to South America, to Medellin, Colombia in 1965, where my father was setting up a new school of business administration, I noticed that the population was divided into a first city for the rich and a second city for the poor, with unplanned illegal barrios growing up the mountainsides, while the bungalows for the well-to-do grew through the valley into distant suburbs along expressways. My economics professor at Harvard, John Kenneth Galbraith, described this as a dual economy. This is an example. This, in fact, is an income distribution of Pune. And you can see that very few people live in the upper income group, and there's a very large people at the bottom. In fact, if we really get into a discussion of that, I would say hardly 3% of our society are in the middle class, who would have life insurance policies, medical policies, and who would own cars and paid income tax. I don't think more than 3% of people in India pay income tax. So my professor, John Kenneth Galbraith, as you know, he was also ambassador here, who used to teach us about the dual economy and dualist society, living parasitically, two societies, one on the other. So walking in the streets of Medellin, I noticed young beggars in rags sleeping on the footpaths. One night I observed an amazing thing. Seeing that a boy had no food, another ragged, unshaven man divided his meager rations, sharing the little he had with his worse-off fellow street dweller. This gesture of compassion filled me with shame, and I felt bound that I must use my skills as an architect to make the world a better place to live. A beggar man became my unsuspected gurus in the streets of Medellin. In 1967 at Harvard, Jose Luis Sert, who was my professor, gave us all a thesis project. He said, choose a country and design housing in that country. I chose Colombia and created a shelter system called Site and Services. My design envisioned very small plots whose services would be enhanced by local government over time, and the inhabitants would build their own homes in accordance with their capabilities. In 1968 was when I was on a Fulbright fellowship to India. I volunteered to design a shelter project for Senate by Mehta, a social worker in Vadodara, but it could not be built. Well, as good luck would have it, in 1972, Senate Bai became Gujarat's Minister of Housing, just when HUDCO was formed, and he invited several architects to design low-cost housing projects. I'm sorry to say the other architects found this uninteresting, but my Jamnagar project became the first economically weaker section housing scheme funded by HUDCO. Now, seeing this project emerge, the World Bank approached me to work in Chennai, and I drew on my thesis at Harvard, creating an effective site and services program, resulting in, this is a kind of an image of it, resulting in thousands of plots. We built thousands of plots. We laid out about 15,000 plots between 1973 and 80. Accessible, this made plots accessible to homeless people who built their own homes. From Chennai, the World Bank carried this concept around the world. Vasant Bawa, the founder of the Hyderabad Urban Development Authority, then engaged me to design low-cost housing for the Class 4 Housing and Federation of the Class 4 Workers of Andhra Pradesh, where I created small core houses on large plots, large enough to become growing. These people who were Class 4, they could afford to make EMI payments for the lowest rank of a HUDCO loan, but the people who rented space from them could not afford. So they became effectively urban managers of rental systems, which is something which is very difficult to do. Then, the fees from this project, it was a rather large project, I used as the seed fund for creating the Center for Development Studies and Activities in Pune. CDSA, as we call it, prepared integrated rural development program in Ratnagiri for the governments of Maharashtra and India, supported by the United Nations. Working with local people in Ratnagiri, micro-level participatory social input plans were drawn up, and through the Lead Bank program, banks piggybacked economic assistance onto the social services scheme. This program evolved into something called Social Inputs for Area Development and became a decadal program from 1980 to 1990 at the Ministry of Social Welfare, supported by UNICEF. Out of this work in the late 1970s and early 80s emerged CDSA's unique watershed development approach, pioneered as a counterblast to the huge watersheds being funded and promoted by the World Bank. The World Bank wanted to increase cash crop production. We wanted to enhance the environment. Cash crops needed massive irrigation, hybrid seeds, fertilizers, pesticides. Ours was an environmental sustainability approach employing reforestation, nullup bunding, contour bunding, and percolation tanks with small irrigation schemes lifting water in the areas. And we also worked with the local villagers, forming something called Pani Panchayats, who managed their own water accounting systems. So from the early 1970s until now, we employed architecture as a social tool, building orphanages and a network of social facilities for the Dalits of Maharashtra, centered at Nagluk in Nagpur. Empathy and compassion are the catalyst of imagination and friendship. They are the creators of self-knowledge and inner awareness. Now, I could show you a few, because the architecture students said if you only talk like this, we may get bored, so show us some of your work. This is Nagluk. Nagluk is a Buddhist center in Nagpur. They train social workers, they teach Buddhist theory, and this is the Dhamma hall, where lectures are given, a small shrine room. And this is some of their campus. It's a very simple brick. It's run by a trust, and it's a well-known center for Buddhist studies. The Dalai Lama visits here often. And in Nagpur, it's a center for people to gather. This is one of the few projects I did in Ahmedabad when I started the School of Planning. It's the Alliance Française building. It's a building which is made of brick, and all the light comes only from skylights, except one skylight wraps down the north wall. Very simple building with not even 5 materials. Probably my first project. So, when you're traveling and when you're involved in various work, you seek new innovations. And so I thought I'd tell a story of innovation. Without our awareness, digital media, art critics, architectural historians, and professors collectively promote a knowledge system inculcated within our meaning systems. The messengers are the high priests of our thoughts, and we believe that what they say is good and correct, and like all Gurunas, we promote this belief system, passing on truths into the future. Thinking within knowledge systems and designing our creative works within their meanings are the unique feats of the human brain, driving our strongest emotional compulsions through conformity, gifting us meaning. If we are successful, our creations will be exhibited in the temples of our culture, in museums and exhibition halls. Yet this meaning system leads us to something I call the human conclusion, wherein almost all architects and urban designers revert to a common formula in a closure of the human mind. To make this short, we all get trapped into the same belief system and the same predictable way of finding solutions within its knowledge system. Imagination is thrown to the winds, and we are not conceptualizing things that we cannot see or touch, but rather copying images from the media. We are seeking the approval of the high priest, most of whom have never designed anything. In other words, life is a trap. As a child, I lived in a suburban house next to similar houses, all laid out on well-drained, well-paved roads, each almost as ugly as the next, confirming the equality and homogeneous social status of the neighborhood. What was called variety and freedom of choice came down to choosing between a ranch-style house, a colonial home, a classical or a Spanish colonial home, a classical house. Take your pick. The plans were all the same, but the elevations were different. This urban fabric was mind-numbing and mundane. Everyone shared the same bad taste. But our knowledge system spoke to us, telling us that this was good. It was the American dream. I saw the analogies between our popular taste, common wisdom, mass ignorance, all fed by stereotypes, by forms of racial, gender, class, and regional biases. One Christmas, that was in 1956, I opened a magic gift that was the talisman of my future. It was a book called The Natural House by Frank Lloyd Wright, changing my life forever. The book unraveled my thoughts and gave me a sense of vision for my future. A new knowledge system gave me a sense of meaning. It told me of a path I could follow for discovery. On that day, at the age of 14, I think I became an architect. It was not the images of the dwellings integrated within the natural landscapes, but the credo espousing nature, human scale, honesty of expression and functionality. This knowledge system fit well into my love for the great wilderness, rivers, lakes, and ocean. This sparked my thoughts, kindled my spirits, and catalyzed my imagination. For the first time, I could dream of alternative worlds, concepts, and objects that were not visible through my immediate senses. However, one day, I saw a large newspaper spread with photographic images of Le Corbusier's forms and sculptural buildings in Chandigarh. It was love at first sight, carrying me on with romances with Ronchamp, La Tourette, and the Marseille block. This is, of course, you all know. And but this was a turning from one knowledge system to another, from a meaning system based in the language of nature to an abstract language of ideologies in the brain. Falling water grew out of nature organically, while the Ville Savoye floated above and away from nature, with all the trees around it cut down, creating an intellectual setting, our abstract landscape, within which this object could float. The American and European knowledge systems grew out of different contexts and meaning. American worshipped earth goddesses, and Europeans worshipped sky gods. Americans idealized log cabins in forests. Europeans idolized white marble temples on hilltops. I resolved this conflict, dissecting the true meaning of architecture. First, I came to know that the truth of architecture is place. Each place has its unique cultural history and symbols. Each place has its own milieu and ambiance. Second, I realized that architecture is poetry. Architecture speaks of intangible moments of transcendental ecstasy, resonating within our deepest feelings. My early works, like the Alliance Française, which I showed you earlier, and CDSA, and the Mahindra United World College of India, were catalyzed by Wright's credo of human scale, kinetic choreographies of movement through space, and integration with the context. My later works drew inspiration from what I now call the culture of construction. In Bhutan, I wanted to use the culture of local materials, local craftspeople, and their simple construction management guided by monks. In Pune, on the contrary, at the same time, I was producing a humongous industrial pavilion in which I drew on the culture of steel and on machine manufacturing technologies. I think it is important that we realize that we all think, imagine, and create within knowledge systems, and that different knowledge systems are competing with one another. There's kind of a cultural imperialism trying to invade our minds and place alien meanings within us. Like the suburbs of my youth, we are victims of popular taste and common wisdom. Star architects are what they call star-architects these days, are creating monumental stunts and making dramatic follies, all getting look at me. By applauding these inane fabrications, we are succumbing to an insipid cultural colonialism. I find it perverse that no major architectural critic is speaking out against monstrosities, in my opinion, monstrosities like the CCTV tower in Beijing. I think we have a picture of that there someplace. Even La Défense, the urban space in Paris called La Défense, and also the terrible museums which are spreading across the world. In India, our own IT giants have spread ugliness in Bangalore, Hyderabad, Pune, and Gurgaon, missing an opportunity to gift a new spirit of built form to India. Even the high priests seem to have their mouths sealed in front of their own knowledge system. Architecture and urban design are potential catalysts for imagination and intellectual friendships. They can be the creators of self-knowledge and inner awareness. They can challenge our senses of compassion and inclusiveness. Okay, this is, of course, you all know the Swiss Pavilion that Corbusier did in Paris. And at some point in my career, I did at the Saludra Institute of Maritime Studies, a long hostel. I think it was influenced by that. And this is the building in Pune for the College of Engineering Pune. It was a college that had almost all boys 20 years ago, and now there are 30% girls, and so we did a women's hostel, all exposed concrete. Drew a lot on my gurus like Sartre and Khan. So anyway, our creations can challenge our senses of compassion and inclusiveness. So listen, I'm talking about now a story of inclusiveness, which gets into our planning work. City plans are not artifacts of accident, but rather arrangements of contrivance. Our urban slums, with urban slums being direct results of elite urban policies, foreign planning models, automobile and real estate-driven concepts, and an amazing lack of public imagination. I say amazing lack of public imagination because even I've read Ranjit Siddiqui's articles showing that the vast majority of people in the Delhi metropolitan area live in illegal settlements. In Bombay, 75% of the people cannot afford any EMI for any dwelling at all, so they don't have a right to the city. So we design cities as if they are tinker toys, not as all-inclusive socioeconomic systems. Yet our cities are the unique feats of the human brain, driving our strongest emotional compulsions. City planning around the world leads us to something I call the human conclusion, wherein almost all urban societies come back to a common set of urban crises in an interesting closure of the human condition. All city plans, directly or indirectly, ironically, exclude most of the urban citizens. To summarize, can I say we all get trapped into the same urban conundrum and the same predictable inhuman city, maybe whether it's Mumbai or Manhattan? In other words, life is a trap. Well, or is it? Modern city planning theory and practice can trace its origins back in history, even to Greek cities. Roman garrison towns are oriental capitals. Modern city plans and campus plans, information technology parks, are slight variations of British cantonment plans. I wonder how many people have studied that, where the military area created a unique social space defined by one's race, occupation, gender, and rank. Indian Jawans at the bottom of this socioeconomic pyramid were in fact part of an elite minority admitted into this unique urban estate characterized by potable drinking water, sewage systems, storm drains, paved roads, and social services. The real cities of India were left to rot. So the cantonment plan was a very clear way of doing things. All university campuses today follow the cantonment plan model. They divide boys and girls, they house people by rank, and even foreign students who are of a different color stay in a different part of the campus. So it seems to me that we haven't gone very far since the cantonment plan. This model is one of the precursors of globalization in urban planning, where gated communities and malls have replaced the lively, informal public domains of traditional settlements. The loss of social space is a metaphor for the loss of community and indigenous identity. An undeclared strategy of city planners is to replace vernacular culture with institutional culture, right from the plan of the city to the architecture of the buildings. Uniforms have replaced pluriforms, which once gifted personal cultural richness and identity. In 1971, I embarked upon an adventure to the Kingdom of Bhutan, crossing the no man's land from Bagdogra to Phuentsholing, where foreigners were forbidden to travel. Not more than 5 other Caucasians were in Bhutan when I arrived, and I had a mission to prepare micro-level plans to enhance the quality of life for isolated villagers. His Majesty, the 4th King, concluded when I arrived and talked to me that no one could participate in Bhutan's development without a personal knowledge of the kingdom. So he ordered me to head across Bhutan by jeep, which he was kind enough to provide me with, over roads cut from cliff faces, running deep into isolated mountain wildernesses. That was a time, 1979, there weren't more than 50 telephones in the whole country, and most of them were with the royal bodyguards and His Majesty. Upon my return to Thimphu, I quickly befriended a small group of young officials, and we set upon a strategy involving the deputation of students to my institute in Pune and setting up a small planning office in Thimphu. We were fighting the global strategy to introduce cash crops into the valleys, creating nutritional problems as monocropping was replacing self-sufficient cropping. Bengali truck drivers carrying these crops introduced STDs along the roadside hamlets, and cash crops like cabbage, dominating daily diets, stimulated iron imbalances and related diseases. What had happened was people had come in, advisors from the FAO, and they said, okay, Paro Valley, make it all cabbages. Trongsa Valley, make it all potatoes. And then you have an economy of scale, and we can sell it in West Bengal as cash things. And they wanted to convert the economy from a self-sufficient agricultural economy to a cash economy. And this created all kinds of things, like people eating food substitutes that they could buy, like crackers and Lay's wafers and things like that, instead of healthy food. So during this stay in Bhutan, I noted the healthy social life wherein department directors, ministry secretaries, and senior military officers all played archery together each afternoon with their drivers, office attendants, and maintenance staff. They all laughed and danced and drank chan. Their women, when their husband would win that village, everybody would dance together and celebrate. Everyone was part of one social group, and there were no divisions. They were all bounded together out of a compassion for community. Over the years, I watched Thimphu grow from 5 to 8 to 37,000 people, when in 2001, I won a competition against CAMSAX and MIT to prepare the capital plan of Bhutan. The Bhutanese Prime Minister, Limpo Jigme Tenli, who was initiating the concept of gross national happiness, took a special interest in this. This is some pictures of, after we did the plan, we designed the Royal Secretariat and the Supreme Court of Bhutan, and we did plans for several cities besides Thimphu, a new town in Denchi in the east. No? So we struggled together with a small team of young Bhutanese architects to discover pathways to make our capital plan more inclusive, resulting in something that I now call the principles of intelligent urbanism. These principles are things like have balance with nature, balance with tradition, and conviviality, etc. These principles acted as a charter through which to filter decisions in our discussions, regardless of there being village meetings or cabinet meetings. We immediately set out involving villagers in planning their own watersheds, transforming them into what they called urban villages through land pooling. This charter of working guidelines grew out of our concepts of gross national happiness and from my earlier work preparing plans for provincial capitals in Sri Lanka, housing communities in India, development plans for cities like Thane and Kalyan, and other cities in South Asia. Limpo Jigme Tenli used the fate of Bhutanese archery matches as the backdrop for our planning work. He rekindled my memories of my first visit when the working day was from 8 o'clock in the morning until 2 o'clock in the afternoon, when the free time was used to meditate and play archery, bonding people into close-knit communities, playing with traditional bows and arrows. One day, a foreign consultant arrived carrying a power bow made from fiberglass with slick arrows, shooting twice as far as a local traditional bow. That day changed Bhutan forever, dividing every archery range into 2 parts, one part for the power bows and the other for traditional bows and arrows, one for the rich and one for the poor. A class society based on Thimphu's archery grounds. A class-based society was born on Thimphu's archery grounds. Soon all senior officials were returning from their foreign tours, with powerboats costing about the annual salary of their drivers and attendants. Thus, the archery matches evaporated as a binding social force, globalizing the entire city into a divisive, competitive society. This parable taught me that the defining factors in traditional societies emerged from within diverse societal components expressing themselves to society as an inclusive collage of pluriforms from the inside outwards. On the contrary, in our contemporary institutionalized global cultures, the uniforms are imposed from the outside inwards, suppressing down from the top on down into the parts. Our vernacular dress and build forms are expressions, while our institutional uniforms are suppressions. This system of articulated stratification lives with us as urban planners, tempering the way we think, how we deal with others, and even our self-images. Inclusiveness is essential for the evolution of civilization, yet we seem to be moving backwards. Inclusiveness is the catalyst of urban planning, imagination, and the creator of civility. It gives communities self-knowledge and raises our awareness of the city. So these are kind of images which we all know. They tell us what is happening in the world. And this is just, again, this some students would like to see. This is the IIM Calcutta campus, which we had to create islands because water is just one foot below the earth. And on these islands, we built in this case, the academic campus or the student hostel campus. This is the lecture hall complex. I wanted to take breaks from my lecture and also let the students know, yes, I also do architecture. But you know, if you're my student, then you have to listen to me talk also. This is the IIM campus. These are all hostels. Of course, that's getting back to Bhutan. That's the capital plan and the capital complex in the middle, where we also designed the Supreme Court of Bhutan. This is the old, ancient 12th century fortress monastery. And this is the National Ceremonial Plaza that we designed. We added these porches on the back of the old fortress monastery. This wall had collapsed in an earthquake, so we rebuilt it with these places for His Majesty and the Dalai Lama of Bhutan, called the Jai Kempo, to come. And it's used very often for religious festivals, for coronations of young kings. We have the young king coronated there, and new prime minister. This is the Supreme Court of Bhutan. And the idea, again, is it's a culture of construction, using all local materials, local craftsmen. Often there are monks who are project managers because they rebuild all these zongs and lakongs. So, again, we have a story of reflection because I think our concern for inclusiveness makes us reflect. It makes us think back in order to think forward. It makes us think even what to speak and write. Collecting memories, attaching subjective meanings to these recollections, and arranging these past events that had faded from reality into virtual concepts are unique feats of the human brain, driving our strongest emotional compulsions. Yet this subconscious archival project leads us to something I call, again, the human conclusion, wherein almost all human societies place values on their memories, grouping them into common narratives of popular wisdom in an interesting closure of the human condition. To make this short, can I say that we all get trapped into the same story of life and the same predictable outcomes, devoid of imagination? In other words, life is a trap. Or is it? Architects, urban designers, and artists are writing stories of the future, drawing on memory and reflections of the past while creating new narratives. Our compulsion to deal continuously in future scenarios leads to a kind of schizophrenia, where we are creating choreographies of future scenes with people moving in our imagined spaces, yet drawing on past references as building blocks for our ideas. Unfortunately, most of the design production we see today is plagiarized from the web, are even cut and pasted in the spirit of commercial proficiency. I think it's more in advertising and in graphic design than architecture, but it's there in architecture also. Urban public policy experts, urban planners, and architects perforce end up writing reports. And as life proceeds, we learn that fiction goes down better than prose with our clients, and a new kind of creative license emerges. Good professionals write well, and successful ones learn the art of weaving conceptual fictions into the prose of clients' budgets and functional needs. Sooner or later, some of us leap out of the professional writing into expressing our reflections and observations in artful forms of literary attempts, like my book, Letters to a Young Architect, that has now been published in 4 countries in 4 different languages, including Chinese and Bengali and Bangladesh, and in India and America. It's out in Gujarati also. Frankly, that was a counterintuitive outcome, as I never imagined that my writing about architecture would figure in the top 10 best-selling non-fiction books in India and be read by peoples of different ages and dispositions. There's a guy, Sumit Paul, here, who's recently put out a fiction novel that I just read. So all of us architects are starting to write. The lesson is that more of us must write, and we must teach our students to write. One of my successes at CEPT University was to influence the curriculum, requiring all incoming students to take something we now call the Writing Laboratory. It's a course for every student in the first and second semester. My own education required me to take writing classes, and that led me into publishing an acoustics magazine, Habitat International in UK, and authoring chapters in books and published by the RIBA, Routledge, and many Indian publishers. I say this only to encourage educators to do the same thing across the country, and to make our young professionals truly literate citizens who can express important opinions and ideas throughout our society. Writing and editing is part of my daily life, and I even remain an unwilling member of the board of editors of Cities Journal in UK. My career as an institution builder and public policy analyst led me to major writing projects. In 1983, I was asked by the United Nations to write their theme paper for the upcoming 7th session of the United Nations Commission on Human Settlements. This was an arduous task, defining the goals and strategies for urban development that 58 member nations had to ratify. In addition to writing the paper, I had to invite all of the United Nations regional commissions to discuss the paper in case, by possibility, I might have offended one of the member nations. So this task stretched over many months in Nairobi at the UNCHS Habitat headquarters. About a year later, the Ministry of Urban Development requested me to represent India at a non-aligned conference in urban development in Sweden, where I was asked to make a major presentation up to the 300 or so international delegates. Don't ask me why the government of India would ask a citizen of one of the 2 countries that the non-aligned people were against to go and represent them, but that's the way things work. At the end of my presentation, a senior Finnish official arose, grabbing much attention with a strongly worded question to me, taking the form of a major accusation. Before coming to the point, she laced her attack on me with several insinuations and then said, "The paper you have just presented is an insult to this gathering." Most of us sitting here were signatories to the charter of the 7th Human Settlements Commission meeting in Angola. The paper you have just presented diametrically opposes the values and principles that we have all debated and agreed upon in that charter's theme paper. What do you have to say for yourself? There was a hushed silence in the large auditorium, with deadly glares directed my way from fellow speakers on the podium. So I got up and walked slowly to the rostrum, and I said, "Thank you, madam, for your wisdom and your kindness. I am the author of the paper you have signed in Angola. Do you have any more questions?" The large audience broke out into howls of laughter and applauded my rebuttal enthusiastically. So writing can have its euphoric moments as well as depressing ones. In 1986, I wrote the Asian Development Bank's white paper on urban development, arguing to the board that the Asian Development Bank should open their lending to infrastructure investments, alleviating health and nutrition stresses in Asian cities. I spent about 3 months in Manila at the Asian Development Bank headquarters writing this paper. After presenting it to the board and receiving a cautioned acceptance, they were sort of at a quandary where to go, so I suggested that they assemble a conference of experts where I would not be there to influence them, documenting or arguing against their doubts. My friend Om Prakash Mathur, who's sitting here, was asked by the bank to lead that follow-up seminar, resulting in a rather heavy book, convincing the bank to go ahead and make investments in the urban sector. Until that piece of writing, the Asian Development Bank restricted its lending to rural and agricultural development based on the popular wisdom and ignorance that urban investments catalyzed migration. It was a moment of euphoria for me when I learned that the board of the Asian Development Bank passed a resolution entering the urban sector of development. So life is not a trap after all. For the true artist, there are secret moments of transcendence, moments of inspiration, when the profound arches above, unhampered over day-to-day trivia. Within that momentary sliver of self-realization lies one's eternal truth and being. Writing, urban planning, architecture are creative catalysts of the imagination. They are creators of self-knowledge and awareness. Now, again a break. That was a Chettinad house in Tamil Nadu, which influenced something called India House. India House is in Pune. On the left-hand side is a real house where I live. On the right-hand side is a studio and an entrance into an art gallery, which is underneath this courtyard. And I believe every building should have a public domain, a place where the public can meet. And every week some students come from different colleges. Next week some are coming from Ahmedabad, about 40 students. And I give them a small talk. Or in this case, Bimal Patel is releasing his book on his father's work in the courtyard. Or we have cocktail parties after or before gallery paintings. This is the entrance with some paintings actually done by Ram Prasad. And this is the art gallery in the basement. And that far painting in the back is called Paradise. It's for IMP's tower in Bombay. Ram Prasad has painted that. So we have a lot of interaction between artists and architects. And this is me sitting with some gundas in my studio. Young architects all look like gundas today with their beards. I can see them all sitting here. And so we all work together. I sit in the middle of the studio and work with them. And this is the house. And pretty much it's full of things from my travels. And friends do come and talk to me there. But often we don't talk to each other. We're too busy like teenagers talking on cell phone. And when Ram Prasad took this picture and we put our phones down, he said, "Who are you talking to?" We said, "Each other, obviously." But yes, this is Suzlon One Earth. It probably was the first very large platinum U.S. lead and India lead and accredited green building. It's the headquarters for a multinational company called Suzlon. And I was very much influenced when I thought it was secret to have a pedestrian space inside with water, and by all of these deep stems which you find along rivers in Maharashtra or in temples in Kerala. And so I have this podium which is covered with gardens and lotus pools. This is the training center. And inside you can see under these photovoltaic cells, this is a courtyard where you can sit and put your feet in the water, and you get indirect lighting through these photovoltaic cells. I always like this temple because it has the louvers, the screens which I have in Suzlon. It has the deep stems, it has the slope grooves and the jollies. So that's the deep stem in the middle of Suzlon One Earth. And this is a chimney. This glass cylinder, look on the right, you can see trees growing out from the bottom. And open at the top, it heats up in the sun. And like your car heats up when you lock it up in a parking space, it becomes very hot. And it sucks air out of the basement and does the air turnover and takes out all of the fumes from the automobiles. So it's a kind of a energy-free way of doing things. These are book letters to young architect, and some of our friends releasing the book. So writing is something which I was talking to you about. It's something very important in my life. Now, to conclude my stories, I was born in America, but my land of actions, or what you people call karma bhumi, is here in India. I was drawn here to the subcontinent through subconscious dreams and primordial urges embedded in my soul. I think everything in life is fate. Yes, narratives hidden within my being were calling out to me to come to India. Once I set foot on Indian soil, I knew I had found my home. I have been blessed to know India through its many living layers of time that still today float one above the other, sharing geographical space and time simultaneously in the form of real people and real friendships. See, I believe in India you even have medieval type of people in the center of some cities. You have modern global industrialists. You have all kinds of people living in the same space as if different cultures and societies are floating one above the other. Through my princely friends in Gujarat in the 1960s and in Bhutan later, I lived the stories of medieval lives, and I designed places appropriate to their heritage and to their meaning system. My friends in the state bureaucracy lived the lives of the socialist state, and I designed towns, replanned cities, and created large-scale housing estates in the spirit of the supply-side economy. Through my friends who were early entrepreneurs, I came to know the meaning of the mixed economy and its precarious life. I helped them find identity through their buildings. Now we live in a capitalist global economy, and my clients' markets spread around the world. And I must work in a culture of construction that is both very Indian and at the same time global. Each of these layers has left its own work ethic, its own thinking, and its own kinds of human relations. So the lesson to me of India lies in its people, through their relationships. It lies in their stories, knitted together into great epics, generating a shared happiness and sense of fulfillment. Yes, I found happiness in India, in Bhutan, Nepal, Sri Lanka, and Bangladesh too. I learned that life is not about the projects we have in hand. It's not about our wealth, but life is simply the quality of our friendships that grow into our life along our journey. If life is a trap, adventure, compassion, imagination, inclusiveness, and reflection are our creative escapes. Thank you very much.
Yes, I was just thanking Christopher for this amazing journey that he's managed to take us through this 1 hour, and my job is to be your co-traveler for the journey from this point onwards, and help you communicate with the audience on the other side. And I don't have to tell you, this is the time for the Q&A, and please feel free to ask questions or offer observations. You may or may not introduce yourselves. So I don't know where to begin. Would you like to raise your hand? And the first hand that goes up is the first question. Yes. Yeah, there's a question there.
Used to call it modern architecture, but now that is in past. So how we name that architecture today?
See, I personally think that modern architecture, what was mentioned, I think this is working. I think what was meant, it was meant to be called contemporary architecture. And people always felt that pre-World War II was kind of an evil period of fascists and dictators and war and concentration camps in the modern age. The term really comes out of the modern age, and there's a lot of debate in Europe that modernism starts when Don Quixote rides out of his village on a donkey and says, I don't believe in God, I don't believe in the church, I believe in myself. So modernism in philosophy actually means the age of self-realization, where you determine your value system, you determine what you want to be, who you are, as opposed to something like the government, the church, the temple, deciding who you are. So modernism actually has a large sort of philosophical meaning in Europe. In America, it means progressive and new. In Europe, it means a modern person who is self-determining. I think, unfortunately, in architecture, we tend to use words for styles like modern, postmodern, which in my opinion is kind of ridiculous, unfortunately. See, we were very lucky in India. When postmodernism emerged, we couldn't afford the magazines, which were published in America. So unless you traveled to America, you didn't get polluted by all this kind of gibberish, which was more academic. It was the high priest, as I was talking about. The high priest in the temples of learning decided that we'll have a new wave of architecture. But, you know, you had some pretty bad buildings. Philip Johnson, who I was honored to meet in his lovely glass house, designed the AT&T building. I think we called it the Chippendale building, because in America, during Paul Revere's time, we made these cabinets out of wood with a top, with a pinnacle like a Greek temple kind of. And so he put one of those Chippendale cabinet roofs on the building. Completely nonsensical, completely up here in the brain, kind of a no-starter. So I don't know, you know, I have a lot of opinions about postmodernism. Unfortunately, we just lost Robert Venturi, who was a great proponent of that. And we used to call it Harvard when Denise Scott Brown, who apparently was married to him, she was a great speaker, and we called her Mrs. Force, and we called him Mr. Form. So all of these discussions about modernism, postmodernism, contemporary architecture, I think they're very important, and I think we should look into the roots of the whole modern movement in terms of people discovering themselves. You telling me, Christopher, the hell with you, I have my own ideas. And I say, the hell with the church, the hell with the government, I have my own self. So I think it's a very important movement in self-realization.
Yes. Yes, Philippe?
Yeah, give him a mic because he has such an impressive hairdo. I don't hear what he says looking at his hair.
Thanks, Christopher. My question is, what advice, I see a lot of young architects here, and you talk of inclusiveness, you know, and we architects do excellent job of the jobs assigned to us, but somehow, there's so much of talent in the country, we still have the worst cities that we are walking in.
We still have the what?
We still have the worst cities that we walk in. So how can we change it as a group of architects, and what advice do you want to give the younger generation for the same?
I think it's a tough question, but it's also an easy question. You know, if you go back and look at the founders of the CIAM, you know, the International Movement of Contemporary Architecture, if you forget about all the sort of sexy, sculpturous buildings that Le Corbusier did, which I love, like Grandchamp, and all these buildings, go back into the 1920s when they started. They were concerned about the same things I talked about today. Walter Gropius, José Luis Sert, Le Corbusier, they were all talking about poor people coming to cities and working in factories, and how do you house them? So they did sometimes utopian plans like Bill Radieux, or the Algiers plan, or some city plans, stuff by Frank Lloyd Wright for the Broadacre City. But what you found was young architects who actually didn't have work were coming up with manifestos. Now, if I were one of you young architects today, I would grab on the opportunity of what I said. 75% of the people living in metropolitan cities in India cannot afford any EMI. EMI is the equated monthly installment to buy any kind of a dwelling. So if you live in a country where 75% of the people don't have a right to the city, they are just floating there, surviving. And you're an architect, and you have planning ambitions, you want to be a famous young architect. for God's sakes, just sit down and plan a city for the people of India. And I'm not saying poor people. I'm saying a city for the people of India. I would have a lot of debates with my friend Shivraj Patel on Chandigarh because we both love Chandigarh, but he says it's an administrative city. So don't criticize it. It's not supposed to be the solution to people's housing. So I think we've done enough South Delhi planning, enough Lutyens planning, enough Chandigarhs, Bhubaneswar, and we need to, the youngsters really have to get their fingers into socioeconomic statistics and find out who are the people of this country and what kind of architecture and what kind of planning they need. And believe me, there's a huge amount of work to be done. And anyone sitting in this office can become the Le Corbusier of the 21st century because we're just coming into the repeat of 1920s. Huh? That's what I would say to do.
The lady next to you. Yeah.
Hi. Today the way we're designing is changing. We're working in teams across the globe. We're working in a day and age where we're no longer working with hands or with paper necessarily, it's all on the computer. How does it really affect our way of thinking as architects?
This is what I call a God question. You're asking me if you were God. Yeah? You would tell me how to survive in this world. Yeah? But see, one of the things I find personally, one of the criticisms I have of my own work, that Alliance Francaise is just 2,700 square feet. And every corner and every brick was thought out. So what I realized is I did a small project, and then I did CDSA, again, everything thought out. United World College. See, Alliance Francaise is 2,700, CDSA is 20,000, United World College is 125,000, and then you come to Suzlon, it's 1 million square feet. And now I'm doing something called the Azim Premji University. In 3 phases, it's about 6 million square feet. And we did a housing project for Abhishek Lodha, a large gated community, which I criticized, but I did one, I'm confessing. The larger the project, the less detailing. The larger the project, the more repetition. The larger the project, the more we go away from things you see in Raj Raval's work. Beautiful details everywhere. So I think that's one of the worrisome things. And it's made me to talk with people in my studio, hey, let's just not do this anymore. It's very exciting if somebody like Mr. Zen Premji comes and says, do a 5 million square foot university. But when you actually start doing it, you realize the players become more, project managers become more important than architects. Contractors become more important than architects. Time schedules and budgets become more important than poetry. So I think this is a kind of a challenge. You're likely, most of the young people here, I think, will get hired by corporations. The era of the individual architect like CYRUS or like Raj and myself, who sit in our studios, which are kind of ashrams, and we deal with young people about poetry and ideas. I really am afraid that that could evaporate as large corporate offices from around the world come into India. And they sort of challenge us, you want to be part of this game or not? Again, it's the individual versus the community. It's a difficult but a good question.
Thank you. There's a question there.
Of the smart cities in India. Would you like to comment on that?
See, smart cities, in my opinion, is just well, it's kind of like green buildings and other 4-letter words. You see, it's a slogan. And I actually find, say, our city was the first city, Pune, to become a smart city, and even it's been told that it's the most livable city in India. So I'm going to say 2 things. Music along with my answer. No, thank you very much. I like it. Huh? So, look, see, to me, a smart city is very simple. If you read any municipal act of any state government in India, it says municipal corporations are supposed to supply potable drinking water, sewage systems, roads, street lighting, footpaths, solid waste disposal, and maybe a couple of other things. Any city that does that, any city that follows its state municipal act and provides its city with these, say, 7 things is a smart city. Not all this nonsense we're talking here. In Pune, the pilot area for the smart cities, now I don't know if you know what the smart cities, the pilot area is an area which will be made a lot of investments, and over the next, I think, 5 years, it's supposed to become equal to neighborhoods awards in Portland, Oregon, and in, I can't remember the city in Australia, which are really smart cities. Right? So what do they choose? They choose Banir and Baliwadi, where you saw India House. Now, I believe that the people who live in Banir and Baliwadi have higher, what is the word, PPP? You'll tell me what it means, personal purchasing power. I believe that we people living in Banir and Baliwadi have higher per capita purchasing powers than people who live in Melbourne and who live in Portland. In other words, you've got people living in very poorly managed neighborhoods in India who are actually richer than the foreigners, and they're telling us that within 5 years, our neighborhoods should be equal to those poor people's neighborhoods. I'm making a joke. What is interesting is the government has come out with something called livability. Livability, I'm making a wild guess, has something like 72 parameters. Right? They have, for example, a parameter called drinking water, potable water. If everyone in your city has a potable drinking water tap, you get 70 out of 100 points. If all those potable drinking taps are metered, you get another 30 points. So you can get under that one heading, potable water, you can get 100 points. If every single household in the city has potable water and it's metered. If every single one has potable water but it's not metered, you get 70 points. So like that, there are clusters of economic factors, etc. Now what I like about this is that if you really are able to measure these, you have to measure the poor people also. You have to measure the slum dwellers. And then you've got a municipal commissioner who sits on the top of this empire in every city, and you can say, look, the points in water supply actually went down. The points in sewage, actually less people as a percentage now have sewage than they did 3 years ago, or maybe more people have. So you can actually start measuring the effectiveness through livability standards of how the people who manage cities are managing them. Smart cities, you can't measure anything. It's just that it's throwing sops to the rich. I mean, I live in the pilot area of the smart city in Pune. There's no pilot project in Pune in one of the large slums where about 40% of the people in Pune live in jhopadis. Why didn't we make a smart city project in a slum in every city? And let's see which city can take people in poverty and give them decent shelter, or decent habitat. So smart cities is a misnomer. It's a sad thing that we got involved in that.
Yes, young man there.
So I think the reason we have such bad examples of architecture is because the people are so much into commercialization and digitalization, and they are not able to rely. They are so much into the hustle and bustle and of the city that they are not able to realize the essence of life, because they doesn't have those pauses in life to realize. So how are there any innovative ways that we can incorporate such pauses in our designs so that people can connect?
Have more
to
bars.
Themselves.
Have more bars and go to drink more. I'm just joking. I think it's a very important question because the story about Bhutan. See, His Majesty when they came in 1979 said, "I'm closing all the offices at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. If I leave the offices open, you people will work, try to earn money and try to consume. So I would rather you meditate or play archery and drink chang with your friends than work." So he actually closed. There were very few offices there, mainly government offices now. But I think what you're talking to has a lot. When I said that in America, we lived in neighborhoods, and every house was as ugly as the next, but we thought it was the American dream. You see, when I grew up, our parents bought these houses in what were called suburbs, and they were laid out on very nice roads with storm drainage and footpaths and whatnot. And every house, actually, there were maybe 3 plans you could choose from. But then you could also choose, do you want a ranch style? Or do you want a Spanish colonial with stucco? Or do you want a classical, like columns in front, like the White House? And you could have the style pasted on front of your house there. And people thought that was good. But that was just consumerism. It was actually very boring. It was actually very numbing of your thought processes. It made people think that life is composed of 3 choices: ranch style, Spanish colonial, and classical. And what you're talking about is actually, you should not be studying architecture, you should be studying philosophy. Because no, I think it was an amazingly insightful question. And I think it's an insightful question because he's concerned not really about architecture, but about our whole consumer society. In everything we're doing that. In everything we're not thinking. We go to bed having the best brand of whiskey every night, and we think that's capped the day. We're not meditating, we're not thinking, we're not living traditional lives of it, if I can be partly saying that. But I think it's a great question, but I frankly feel it's way beyond my capacity to answer.
Yes, there's a question. Young lady there.
Good evening, sir. Can you please name a few fictional books that have inspired your architectural work?
Fictional books that have inspired my architectural work. Fictional? That's a good question. You know, everybody would answer Ayn Rand, you know? But, you know, everybody here, even the non-architects, you know, I think traveling, you know, I talked about travel. I think travel, and maybe books on travel, where you have cases where, you know, people are living in particular environments in the cities and the architecture, impacts on them. Right off the top of my head, you can read Sumit Paul's most recent book. Is Sumit here someplace? He was here in the beginning. Maybe
He's there.
He's there. He's just written a book about a murder case now, which I read. And I think when he wrote that, he was walking through one of my buildings, and it inspired him to write about a murder case. But do look up on Amazon Sumit Paul, and you can read, what is it, The Dead Only Kill, or what's the name of that book?
The dead can also kill.
The dead can also kill. So I'll tell you, it's the dead that also can also kill inspires my next building. No, really, I like to write, but I think, see, you could call The Natural House, we showed that, you could call it fiction. It's a book by Frank Lloyd Wright. And when I was a kid, I think I was 14, my aunt gave it to me. And I had been a terrible student. I didn't want to be anything when I grew up. And when I got that book, I read through it in one day, from maybe 2 o'clock in the afternoon until 4 o'clock in the morning. And I said to myself, I'm going to become an architect. So, and that's a piece of fiction. If you read a lot of the classic writing of architects in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, you'll find a lot of inspiration there.
Thank you, sir.
Yes, there's a question. Yes, young lady there, behind Arun. Yes.
Hello, sir. In your lecture, you mentioned writing and the fact that you took writing classes and you came up with a book as well. And my question is that as students, when we are asked to refer to works, not just in architecture, in other professions in India as well, we often tend to go and refer foreign authors, and which books are great, and there are also Indian authors, but do you feel that there is a lack of documentation or lack of writing in India in general as compared to UK and America? And also, since childhood we are always asked that what would you like to do when you grow up, and questions like these, which I think are a bit limiting, and I also think that as students we are just starting out and we have this complex of what wisdom can we impart or what can we add in the profession. But any advice or ideas of how we can start writing or documenting at our level, and maybe someday we can.
See, I think the first thing is that just start writing. Send it to Sumit Paul, A+B, who's the editor. No, I'm serious now. In my office, I've told young kids, like recently one of the boys made a planogram of our building, and I said, send it to Maria Lewis in, what is it, the Indian art, what's it called? Architecture and Interiors. So he wrote an article. I was in Tuscany and I got, I think it was from Sumit's office, to write something on my work and environment. So I asked the boy in my office, why don't you, Anandra, why don't you write an article? I can't do it. I should take these buildings right. He wrote a beautiful article. So I actually feel like if you want to learn to swim, jump in the water. Nobody's going to teach you how to write. I can tell you to go for writing classes. I'm sure that there are a lot of tutorials in writing. What I've done, see, unfortunately I became on the board of management of a university in Ahmedabad called CEPT University. And because I've been involved with that university for 50 years now, so I said if I have one impact on this university, everyone who comes to study here will learn to write something. So I copied what happened to me when I was a freshman. I said every incoming student will spend 2 classes, 2 times a week, for first and second semester in a writing laboratory. What happens in a writing laboratory? You walk in, the teacher gives everybody paper and you write with pencil. You write on some topic, like what building do you like the best? You can only write something like 5 or 10 pages. Huh? And then you hand it in, you come back the next 2 days later, he gives you another assignment, and then he calls you one at a time. And he says, listen, young lady, every time you say Jhabvala, you say the Jhabvala. Every time you say Christopher, you say the Christopher. Huh? So he circles all those D's. Huh? And lo and behold, after 2 weeks, you stop writing the in front of people's names. Huh? And then one by one, he starts picking up your mistake. And in a laboratory, by the end of the semester, you can write fairly well. You can at least write a letter applying for a job. Or, because people don't know how to do that. See, one advice to students since we're about writing, you know that we get letters through email that say, Dear Madam Sir, I love your architecture so much. And I know that they just send the same email to hundreds of people. Right? But, so, you know, use a little smarts when you're writing letters of application. But you're talking about writing creatively. I would argue with you, take a topic, okay, you're sitting in Joseph Allenstein's complex, and I think Professor Ghosh has added to it. Huh? Write an article about it. It's a very interesting building. Huh? And you can write an article about this center. And I'm sure out of the 34 journals on interior design and architecture, one of them is going to publish it. And if it's really, really good, A+D may publish it.
That is still a commentary on this evening's journey. Why not? Yes.
I'm not an architect, but I have a very basic question. Almost every city and town in the country is spreading, and when one travels, one sees that it's totally haphazard growth, unplanned, chaotic, and I'm sure all this planning is being done by the government agencies. Is there any mechanism under which they consult, say, prominent architects, planners, or other architectural bodies so that you can contribute in some way or the other?
I'm not sure whether I should answer that or whether everybody here should answer. I actually feel, you see, what your question is very relevant actually, because what happens is there are so many acts and authorities. If you're working in Bombay, there are something like in Panvel, the new international airport system. So there's the Maharashtra State's Roads Authority, which has authority over planning something like 4 kilometers on all sides of the major expressways which are winding around the airport. Then there's the CIDCO Development Corporation. And then there's the Bombay Metropolitan Regional. Recently somebody asked me to do a kind of a community plan for 200 acres, and I came to know before starting this that there are 4 authorities who are supposedly controlling planning. But they're not planning, they're just controlling. The problem is that our planning legislation is more and more control and less visionary. Now what happened if you go 100 years ago? Probably the ugliest and dirtiest city in America was Chicago. It was a town for a meat packing town where cattle from all over the Midwest and West came and they butchered these animals and turned them into food modules and sent them back as food all over America. And they poured the blood into the rivers, which went into the lake. And people said that even the rivers were red. So here you have such a stinking city, full of all kinds of problems. And leading citizens get together and they made a competition for an imaginary plan of Chicago. So I feel architects should get together with chambers of commerce, because commerce is suffering. It's not just people on the street, it's not just poor people. Industry is suffering, commerce is suffering because we have terrible cities. And we should do competitions in every city for a new plan for those cities. So I think it has to come from the people up. You see, in New York City, there are block groups, there are community groups called, I think, street groups or block groups. And they're all the time trying to stop nonsense from happening on their street by the corporation. So our people are not organized. See, the government is not going to give you something when you're not there to ask for it or to criticize it. In India, in our wards and in our communities, we don't have community membership. We don't have community viewpoints. People all think, oh, the government should do something for me. What about people's responsibilities? What about people making groups and voicing what their interests are? Because government is actually trying to control things. They're trying to stop crimes of building buildings that collapse. They're trying to stop overcrowding, having setback rules, and they're trying to regulate things. So visualizing new kinds of things, I think it has to come from the people. Yes, from architects too.
Last two questions, and then we'll have to conclude. This gentleman there.
So when you're talking about planning and talking about slums and talking about smart city, what happens to India's villages? I mean, have we clearly abandoned them as a policy, as a planning thing? That, like, you know, when we were growing up, it was like 80% of India was in villages.
First, I have to tell you, this is a very dangerous man standing there. He was the editor of the Pune Mirror, and I wrote 15 articles on the planning of Pune through the Peshwa period and the Marat period. So we actually have a long association. But I think that's another place. See, we have so many architecture students, and they wonder, what can we do? What about our villages? Now, what about the small towns? And I feel, if I were a young architect, I would not settle in Pune, Bombay, Delhi, etc. I would find a really nice town like Swami Malai in Tamil Nadu, or some nice town, and I would go and start working with that town. But I think architects have to go there, but they have to go there maybe like, I don't know, what was it, Meyer, who went to Etwa and did a plan for Nehru, a veteran? People used to do that. You know? Architects used to go and live in areas and do innovative model kind of plans for rural development and things like that. And the trouble is, you're right, we tend to think of architecture as a skyscraper, and we don't think about villages. But are you suggesting to me that I should tell students that they go work in villages there? Or that I should write it, I can write an article?
Let's not focus about regular conversations when we're talking about huge urbanization in India and huge migration happening. And so clearly there's a form of planning here and sustenance and all that. So where villages are not figuring in the discourse or priority anywhere probably.
No, I think it's.
I mean, we're talking about smart city and getting votes out of it. We are not talking about smart villages. I mean, and villages were essentially smart in India program. This is
I thought that also. No, but the point is this. There has to be some kind of leadership to do this. Like, we can all sit in Delhi and the International Center and say we should do something about villages, but maybe you and I should choose a village and we should start working there. No, seriously. And you as a journalist and I as an architect can then share our experience. Because we're always telling other people to do this. But I think, you know, the 50s and 60s in India was a wonderful period. There were people actually doing this. There were people actually going to villages and starting all kinds of social work. And in Ahmedabad, when I came, there so many, Seva was there, and so many social workers, and really effective work was being done. And I think effective social work, there can be social architecture which is effective. But I think that's a very good point.
Well, dear, I think we had space only for one question, but this gentleman has already overtaken the lady there, so you might as well ask your question, and then we'll go to the lady, and let that be the last question.
Sir, if we aim to reinterpret a city's philosophy through architecture and planning, what do you think that needs to be done in the current scenario if we talk about Delhi itself?
Could you repeat that slowly?
So, if we aim to reinterpret a city's...
We aim to
reinterpret the city's philosophies and the working and people's thoughts through our planning and architecture as a whole, collectively? What should be done? What should be our approach? Or what is there that still needs to be done?
First have to, South Delhi, I don't know, Ranjit is an expert, so you might have to leave early. But, the plan of 1962, paid for by the Ford Foundation, basically brought in a lot of American concepts, like plot coverage, setback, deficit, all these things. No? And the funny thing about the plan is, I may be wrong, Professor Chisty can correct me, but the urban villages in Delhi were not covered in that plan. That you could do anything you wanted in a village, and the plan was so American, it didn't have any automobile repair areas, any printing shops, any furniture manufacturing. So if you look at the villages in Delhi, they have, on plots which are maybe 15 feet wide, they have 6-story towers going up now. Because it's a very funny thing, we have American planning here in South Delhi, but in the villages we have nothing. So you go to Maroli or any of these villages, they're really terrible. So I think we need to look at, again, for India, what would be what do people need? What can they afford? And we need to look at the ability to pay of people, where they work and where they live. And we need to come up with alternative city planning models then. It could be, my suspicion is my site and services project, where you have maybe 300 square foot plots, which are 11 or 10 feet wide, and you let people build their own houses, because they're building their own houses anyway. So why don't we lay out with water supply, sewage, and storm drains, and some sort of footpath, plots, which could be 300-400 square feet, and let people build their own houses, and make it legal, make it part of a system where they get the basic 7 smart city inputs now. And then we develop neighborhood plans, and we develop ward plans and things out of that. But what you're asking is what needs to be done? We need to start over and look at all the rules now, the setback rules, the coverage rules, and we need to either throw them out and say that they're not applicable, and come up with new ideas about how to do planning. Because we're trapped in a kind of system of town planning, like development control rules, planning rules, etc., which are creating the cities we're living in.
Shouldn't the cultural context, the original Indian context, be restored somehow?
See, I agree with you, but by that you don't mean conservation. You mean if a new town is planned, I believe, buildings can have shared walls with courtyards. They can have pedestrian paths leading to them, park the cars in some parking zone and let people walk into pedestrian areas. Like, you could take Old Delhi and say, okay, that's a planning model for a modern city. And then how do you do that? What do you learn from Old Delhi about environment, sharing walls and cutting heating, courtyards, public domains, public little places for people to meet, feed birds and whatnot. So I think what you're saying is, why don't we take 2 steps backwards and walk 3 steps forward by learning from the past. I think that's something that can be done. And then, see, you young people can come up with new models, new prototypes, new visionary ideas. That's what I'm trying to tell you. You know the names of Walter Gropius and you know the names of Le Corbusier, but you know that they did competitions in the 1920s to think of new models for cities in Europe. Some of the models were ridiculous. I think many of the things Corbusier thought of were very utopian, driving on tops of buildings and things like that. But still, see, it's even good to do a ridiculous plan to scare people into thinking we need to change. So even if young people come up with plans which are kind of preposterous now, like I've done a plan for South Bombay, purposely a preposterous plan to house young people in South Bombay, because South Bombay is dying because young people can't afford to live there. Therefore, MNCs are moving out of Bombay, so you get 25% of the offices empty because you can't hire people, right? And you have no place for young people to live. So out of 10 students who study in Bombay universities, only 3 get jobs there. Everybody migrates out. Bombay is a dying city. The metropolitan area is exploding. Interesting kind of contradiction. But we need new planning ideas, new housing ideas to bring young people back into the cities. It means small studio apartments and things like that.
How is the smart city?
I think there's the last question, the girl in the orange.
Hello everyone. Good evening, everyone. Sir, I just wanted to ask that how, as an architect, we can change mentality of people, their social behavior through architecture.
There's another God question. If I were God, I could answer that. But I think I would first get a PhD in psychology. But see, how we can change people's mentalities? I think, frankly, when you walk into the old style campus, not so much the new one, but when you walk in, even here, you look up at the ceiling, you see the common man, if he walks in here, he gets some idea that, guess what? There's a better life out there. So I think taking school kids on tours of pieces of architecture, both historical pieces as well as modern architecture in Delhi, expose the kids, expose youngsters in primary and secondary schools, and tell them, we can also have a course. We can insist the government have a course for secondary schools on what is architecture and what is good space, and students should be taken to those places to see what it's like.
Thank you, sir.
Well, quick, yeah.
I just want to ask one closing question. As we see the architecture in Rameshwaram or in Shiv Mandir in Aurangabad, which has stood test of time, and we can still go there and feel and get inspiration. But today's architecture, it is just like use and throw, with a life of 50 years, 100 years or 200 years. After 200 years, there will be no trace of that architecture which we are going to be calling modern architecture and other things. And in fact, it is more of engineering now than architecture. So how you sum up the future of architecture?
Do you want to answer that, Jessica? See, look, I mean, it's true. If you go to Allura and you say Kailash Temple, I mean, that's hard to beat. But there was a lot of bad architecture done at that time also. You know, Daulatabad near Allura was actually called Deogiri. It was actually the first fort. It's in 3 levels now. The first fort was actually built by the Hindu kings now, and it had one kind of architecture, and then next the Badami Empire built the next level, and then the Mughals built the top. And there's actually different colors in those buildings as you go up. And there's some pretty bad architecture that was done in that period also now. Most of it, like you're saying, our architecture will disappear, the bad architecture. And I think that would be lovely if the bad architecture disappears and the Kailashas, they stand in time. But I think, look, there are some very good architects in India, and they're doing very good work. Let's not paint a picture that there's nothing good happening. And I think as our society matures, see, right now it's going in a period where consumption has been going up for the last 20 years, and everybody wants to wear a pair of Levi's and wear a uniform, which I talked about. Everybody wants to wear the Levi uniform instead of having a pluriform. But we'll reach a saturation point, and people will go back and start asking what happened to our traditional spaces, what happened to our communities, what happened to compassion, and we will go back to it. So, have faith.
Thank you. Time to say thank you. And may I request Awa to come to the dais and to needful.
Just before I do the thanks, there was a young lady who's asking a question about fiction. And it's something sort of occurred to me, and it's something I read some years ago, the book, Nancy Horan's debut called Loving Frank. I don't know if it's Loving Frank. It's about Frank Lloyd Wright's relationship with Mema, early part of the 20th century, and during a time of his creative time. And then, of course, you have Arundhati Roy, who graduated from the School of Planning and Architecture. So fiction and architecture is interchangeable. But anyway, that's by the by. Professor Benninger, thank you so much. And I want to thank you on behalf of the Jhabvala family and SPA. This was really very enlightening insight. to your journey through a very full and obviously very fulfilled and indeed fulfilling life. It's quite breathtaking, actually. What you have achieved in your lifetime is astounding, and I think many people are aware of that. It's an inspiration to people of all ages in all walks of life. And I think what's particularly interesting is the number of young people you've attracted today and the questions that you've had from there. Just goes to show the influence you've had, and it's still spreading out, and you urging the young people to rise to the challenges, and I think that's really encouraging. Thank you. Your talk was also a very fitting tribute to our father, C.S. Jhabvala, for the way that you celebrate those that have taught you, and those in turn that have benefited from learning from you. I think that's a very important theme that features in your books as well, is the learning. And if I can just quote your words back to you, which is, there is only one kind of good luck in your life, and that is a good teacher. And I think you're clearly the proponent of that, so thank you for that. Can I just, as a small token of appreciation from our family, my sisters and I would like to make a small gift Before ending, I have just a few more important thanks to make. My sister Renana for her initiative and her ideas and her organizational skills. And as we know, without her, we wouldn't be having these series of lectures. Thank you for her. And I would like to thank Professor Chisti Iftikhar, thank you very much, and Professor Mihir Bhatt for their role in the selection of the speaker. Obviously, they had a really good selection, and for planning the event, and in many ways making the lecture series a real success. Thank you to them both. Also, Iftikhar for ably conducting today's session, introducing today's session as well. Professor Mahavir and Professor Chetan Vedya, I'd like to thank you for helping the selection of the speaker as well. Special thanks to Professor Mahavir for all your help in making this event possible. Thank you. Can I also just thank Ram Prasad, who's here, who orchestrated the arrangements today. Thank you for that, Ram. Finally, Bharti, who you see walking around with the roving microphone. She's been really worked hard in the background, and Nina too. In particular, Bharti, thank you for all your help. But once again, ladies and gentlemen, thank you to you as well.